All right, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Erin Evenhouse from SUMC, your host today. Today we're convening in a webinar and workshop about how states are moving the emissions needle. So this is a time where cities are leading the way and many of us are looking towards the opportunities in a new administration. But we know that states can also make or break efforts on both sides and even be innovative themselves once in a while, as we'll hear today. States are laboratories for new ideas, and I just read today on Bloomberg that 23 states as well as DC have greenhouse gas reduction targets. So this is applicable a lot of places. Really looking forward to your suggestions, questions, and ideas. Today's event occurs in two parts. Our webinar, we invite you to submit questions and comments into the chat box and Q&A function. Any that we don't get to can, of course, go into part two, which will be breakout sessions in a separate Zoom meeting. You should have received that link in your email. Israel will put it on our chat box and it'll show up later here as well. So again, I'm Erin Evenhouse, your host from the Shared Use Mobility Center. It's my absolute pleasure to introduce our accomplished speakers today. From the Northeast, Vicki Arroyo is the Executive Director of the Georgetown Climate Center, and she's a national leader on climate change. In California, Sam Gregor is the Manager of Planning and Regulatory Development at the California Air Resources Board. SUMC partner in the Innovative Clean Mobility Options Program. And from here in the Midwest, Ashwat Narayanan has his hand in several progressive transportation initiatives in Minnesota. We'll also, of course, have our breakout sessions that will feature some of our speakers, as well as Tony Dutzik, who's the Associate Director of the Frontier Group, and SUMC's own Strategy and Policy Director, Ellen Partridge. Just a little bit about SUMC and why we're here today. We were established in 2014 with a mission to advance mobility for all. So when we're here considering reducing emissions, we know that shared use plays a critical role alongside land use and that zero emissions vehicles aren't enough. Our work on the ground includes over 100 shared mobility pilots and projects around the country, including with the aforementioned California Air Resources Board, as well as multiple projects with the FTA. And I think anybody who's here today knows why we need this work. The need is urgent. We live on a warming planet in a pandemic, so we need to make things happen on the ground, scale up our lessons, and build on our successes, and we need to do it fast. Transit and other shared uses are critical tools that we need to work on together to make them work better at every level of government. For us at SUMC, that feeds into everything that we do. Among our programs that we want to be resources for you in your own work are research tools and resources on what works, what we need. We have a learning center with extensive information about shared mobility, as well as an emissions calculator. That calculator says shared mobility in the top 50 cities alone could help save 40% of total current US transportation emissions. We partner at the federal, state, and local level on policy efforts, including advocacy networks, our own platforms, great work with some partners here in Chicago. And we connect private and public leaders through new partnerships, ideas, and opportunities. So that's webinars like we have here today, as well as our flagship annual Shared Mobility Summit. Hope that you all save the date and join us. And we're going to keep using these spaces to learn and come together on moving the needle on emissions and all of the other important issues we need to address across the board. With that, I'll turn it over to Vicki Arroyo, the Executive Director of the Georgetown Climate Center.
Thank you, Erin, and good afternoon, everyone. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about our center, which facilitates something called the Transportation and Climate Initiative, although I will say that we work with states all over the country, especially on electric vehicles. And so it's really a pleasure to be here. We are based at Georgetown University Law Center in Washington, D.C. And if you go to the next slide, please. Just briefly, our center was launched about 11 years ago now as a resource to the states to inform the federal dialogue in Washington with lessons from the states, and also to serve as a resource to states and cities as well, especially on adaptation. And we work on both mitigating climate change and adaptation through research, facilitation, convening. Some of the pictures that you see here, including when Gina McCarthy and her folks from EPA were sitting around the table with us and other partners, including companies, utilities, and NGOs and think tank folks and state officials on a bipartisan basis, and helping to craft and inform the Clean Power Plan and other sessions that you see as well, featuring state leaders from, in the case of the top slides, Ben Grumbles, you might recognize, he's the Secretary of Environment in Maryland. Next slide. So the Transportation and Climate Initiative has been around since 2010. The states in this region have been collaborating for some time now, as many of you might know, on the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which is a cap and invest program for stationary sources for the power plants. And several years ago, the energy and environment officials from those states asked us to facilitate dialogues that would include their transportation agency counterparts who had not generally been at the table, and helping to think of strategies to reduce emissions from this important sector, indeed the leading sector now in the region and the nation in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. So we've been facilitating a dialogue for several years now. Next slide, please. And in the early days of TCI, we worked on a variety of things, including work groups that were populated by state employees and supported by our staff and consultants, and worked on things like looking at the freight flows throughout the region and how they might be able to be more efficient and take some of the freight movement off the roads, for example, and look at shipping as an alternative, setting up a network for electric vehicle charging infrastructure and dealing with some of the barriers to that, and putting tools on the website where people could see where the gaps in that charging infrastructure are, working with MJ Bradley and Associates, keeping that tool up to date, working on active transportation solutions and sustainable communities, and real-time information of bus and transit information. But in more recent years, we'll go to the next slide, the conversation has included a subset of the states, although most of the states who have really wanted to seize the opportunity to work on these issues regionally through a policy that would actually reduce emissions more definitively in this region. And it's a really tremendous opportunity because we have obviously millions and millions of people, over $5 trillion in GDP, more registered vehicles than in California. Most of the emissions are from transportation, especially in a region that has had progressive policies like RGGI that I mentioned earlier, and renewable standards driving emission reductions in their power sector. And a modeled cap in this region would cover more than 3 times the carbon pollution that's already covered by the RGGI cap. So it's a considerable opportunity. And you see there in the pie chart that the transportation emissions are quite large compared to the other sectors. So it's really important to try to do more on this sector. Next slide. So we've been engaged in a real public conversation about this since 2017, when we had 2 large workshops, one in Washington, D.C. and one in New York City during Climate Week. We then, with the states, had a series of listening sessions throughout the region in 2018. Hundreds and hundreds of people came, 100 staff employees from the various states and agencies participated and facilitated conversations around what the policies should look like and what the needs are in the region. And that led to the states saying that they would work together in 2019 to develop a policy. You see 3 regional TCI workshops that happened in the before times in 2019 that had 1,000 people either in person or live stream. And now we actually have up to 4,500 submissions on a portal where we're getting input from people about the design of a regional policy that would cap emissions and reduce them and invest in communities and in solutions that actually reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but often bring a lot of other benefits as well. We could talk about that in a minute. So very active community engagement at the regional level and in individual states over the years. Common themes that are coming out of this conversation are the need to focus on equity considerations, given the disparate impacts we're seeing in this COVID era, of course, communities of color in particular being hit hard by COVID for all kinds of reasons, but air pollution being a factor for sure. Really important to lean in on these issues. Next slide, please. With that input and a lot of analysis that's taken place, the states drafted a memorandum of understanding at a very high level that was released at the end of last year, informed by those workshops that you saw. We were originally on track to finish that MOU in the spring of this year, but of course, the governors were distracted with all their need to focus on COVID and the crisis around the pandemic. So we have spent this year still working though at the senior state official level and with public outreach and with additional modeling, including looking at how the COVID pandemic would affect, for example, the reference cases and the information that we had provided before the pandemic. And we had a robust conversation on equity in a September workshop as well. Next slide. So the features of a regional cap and invest program are as follows. The advantage of a program like this, as opposed to, for example, another program that might set a price signal like a tax, is that it does guarantee pollution reductions under that cap. That's the primary goal, of course. It does create a dynamic and transparent market. Cap and invest is a method that has worked in this region with RGGI. And of course, California has capped the emissions, the fuels emissions as well from the transportation sector. Under the proposed program, wholesale fuel distributors would be required to hold allowances that account for the pollution caused by burning their fuels. And this will create a dynamic marketplace across the region that will encourage fuel companies to diversify and innovate as the cap declines and fewer emission allowances become available. And of course, it's a larger market than if you just had one state acting alone. So that's another advantage. Multiple states on a bipartisan basis, I should say, are part of this dialogue, proposing to act together. The fuel suppliers will have options for reducing their costs and the cost for consumers. And the consumers will benefit from the investments that they will help drive through partnership with their states. Next slide. So this just shows some of the modeling around the potential caps that the states are looking at, anywhere from a 20% reduction to a 25% reduction. And depending on how stringent that cap ends up being set, annual proceeds could range from 1.4 billion at the start to up to over 5 billion in the 25% case. And emissions will decline more gradually over time. The proceeds for the investments and the investments themselves really drive a lot of the benefits of the program. Next slide. And so we've done some modeling that shows what some scenarios might be in terms of the investment opportunities that are available from these resources. The lower numbers show a 20% emissions reduction scenario, and the higher ones suggest what's possible with a 25% reduction scenario. And of course, the 22 number would fall in between. And just for comparison's sake, the total proceeds of the recent VW settlement distributed in the TCI regions was 700 million. And so that was, of course, a one-time thing, whereas we're looking at what would be annual figures here. And with the kind of investments that you see on this slide in electric vehicles, including buses and active transportation options and other amenities, we could see electric transit buses increased up to 44,000 transit buses by 2032, up to 42,000 electric school buses in the region by 2032. Bike lanes and sidewalks, investment of over 5.6 billion region-wide in 2032. So, some really substantial opportunities to really help move the needle, as the theme of today's presentation suggests. Next slide. And reducing emissions from the transportation sector is so important, not just for greenhouse gas benefits and dealing with the damaging effects that we're already seeing of climate change in the region and beyond, but of course there's other pollution, particulate matter, ozone, nitrogen oxides that come from the burning of diesel and gas that contribute to cardiorespiratory diseases. So a lower carbon transportation system has enormous potential to drive air quality benefits, reduce asthma and other respiratory illnesses and cardiovascular conditions, cut the number of deaths and lost sick days from work and school. And this is especially true, as I mentioned earlier, in low-income communities and communities of color, which have for a long time carried a disproportionate burden from air pollution. And of course, often folks don't have access to transportation alternatives, including safe walkable and bikeable communities and safe, affordable transit. So these are all things that this program could support. Next slide. So an independent analysis that was done by the Harvard School of Public Health and other colleagues that you can see here listed on the bottom of this slide indicates some of the estimated public health benefits from those opportunities in active transportation and getting out of smelly diesel buses, et cetera, in the region. And these quantifiable benefits that you see here, up to $11 billion, come from reductions in the particulate matter and the pollution, reducing traffic congestion and making streets safer for pedestrians, reduces accidents, and of course saves lives. We know that also when it's safer to walk and bike, people take advantage of that, and that physical activity actually also brings substantial health benefits. And so that's what these monetized public health benefits of as much as $11 billion comes from. Next slide. So in addition to those benefits that were realized, if you just take the proceeds from the modeling that I shared and spread it across the region, what's significant is that more recently the states have said that they would commit in the final MOU, which is coming out later this year, to a minimum of 35% investments for the benefit of underserved and overburdened communities. So that would drive even more benefits in some of those areas that are already disproportionately affected by pollution. They also have agreed to establish equity advisory bodies to inform the state spending and also complementary policies. There will be transparency through annual review and reporting on program impacts. And I know we have a colleague here from CARB, and I want to give a shout out to California for their leading work in community engagement. We certainly have benefited from hearing about that and learning about that over the years. And that has informed a lot of these commitments that the states are now leaning into. And a robust conversation is also happening around complementary policies. We already see a number of states in this region and beyond working with California on zero emission vehicle standards. There are other opportunities to reduce emissions from fuels and vehicles as well. Next slide. I'm not seeing the slide advance, but I think probably the next slide would probably just be maybe talking about next steps. And that is the MOU is coming out this year. And we're looking forward to seeing which states step forward at this time. Like with RGGI, there'll be an opportunity for states to join after this time too, of course. Participating jurisdictions will then work on developing a model rule together with, again, additional public engagement. And in many cases, the states will likely work with their legislatures as well, if there are any legislative steps that would be needed to implement such a program and move forward with conducting rulemaking, et cetera. So that's it. Thanks for the opportunity to update you on what's happening in the Northeast with the Transportation and Climate Initiative.
Thank you very much, Vicki. And I apologize for the lag with some of the slides. It always has to be something on these webinars. So next we're going to be hearing from Sam Gregor with the California Air Resources Board. Sam, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thank you, Erin, and thank you for the shout out, Vicki. And I apologize, I've been working from home for 8 months and I still can't figure out how to use video on my camera when it comes to Zoom meetings. So anyways, for those that don't know me, I'm Sam Gregor. I'm a manager with the California Air Resources Board. I've been in air quality for 20 years. I started out with the Sacramento Air District in 2000 and then joined CARB in 2008. 95% of my career has been on incentive funding and spending funds. So while Vicki discussed ways in which we can bring revenue in to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and turn over fleets to zero emissions, it's been my job and my pleasure to spend the money that comes in through various revenue sources such as motor vehicle fees, and most recently our California climate investments, which started in 2013 to bring in revenues. And so if you can go to the next slide, what I've been asked to do is provide an overview, a brief overview of what we've done regarding our funds that we receive from the cap and trade or California climate investments. We're one of roughly 20 state agencies that do receive funds. Our agency also oversees, a different division oversees the implementation of all of those funds. What we oversee is, in my branch and my division, is low carbon transportation investments. And so that's what I'll be discussing and going through. I'll also discuss a little bit about what we were required to do many years ago, really to try to understand the barriers to accessing clean transportation for low-income and disadvantaged communities. And then I have a few slides of lessons learned where I'll focus on what we've learned from our clean shared mobility projects, which Shared Use Mobility Center has been a great partner in a number of those. And then just some policies that come to the top of my mind that if other states are going to try to adopt what we've done here, some policy drivers that I think I want to touch on and try to explain. So with that, if you want to jump to the next slide. As was mentioned, we're trying to transition our fleet to zero emissions to meet climate change and air quality goals. The governor signed an executive order recently where we would go to new vehicles, all zero emissions by 2035 and 2045 for the on-road and off-road sectors. We are committed to advancing transportation equity with our investments and increasing access to clean transportation. Since 2013, we have received and administered roughly over $2 billion in California climate investments to do that, both for on-road and off-road vehicles and equipment. And of that, over $30 million, $300 million has been invested specifically to address equity. We call that portion of it the Clean Transportation Equity section of low carbon transportation. And the goals are really to understand the barriers and to overcome those barriers by directly investing in low-income households, low-income and low-income and disadvantaged communities. And in the next slide, in 2015, the legislature passed a bill that really is going to move the state towards achieving and reducing greenhouse gases through various clean energy and clean air policies. This includes widespread transportation electrification, procuring energy from renewable sources, and energy efficiency and conservation. There were also requirements that the California Energy Commission and our agency do two studies to understand barriers for low-income folks to get into clean transportation and energy. And so I was part of a great team who oversaw the on-the-ground work that Vicki mentioned, going up and down the state to various communities and talking to them and trying to understand really what the critical issues were that held them back from getting access to clean transportation. The results of that are included in this, what we call a final guidance document. We identified 5 main barrier categories. And as you can see on the bottom of the slide, accessibility and convenience, reliability and affordability. How do we know what the community-based needs are? There's not enough education and outreach for folks to understand what there is. How do we invest in planning, infrastructure, and additional investments to get these communities to overcome those barriers? So on the next slide, within that report, we had, I believe, over 50 recommendations that we called across numerous state agencies in California and a number of local agencies, including air districts, MPOs, and other transit-related agencies, that if they implemented those recommendations, that many of the barriers that we were able to understand could be overcome. And we came up with what we see at what back then we had 6 priority recommendations that are listed here that we really focused on the first 2 years after this study came out in 2018. And I won't go through them in too much detail, but they are important because a lot of the priority recommendations are now built into what we're doing as we fund clean mobility programs. And so if you go to the next slide. So what we have here is, or what I've listed here is, we have 3 categories of investments for equity. The first category is our vehicle ownership projects. Many low-income households do have old vehicles. So we have 3 programs to help them get into cleaner vehicles. The Clean Vehicle Rebate Project, which helps offset the cost of new vehicles. Clean Cars for All, which is a program where a low-income person can turn in an old vehicle and get a much higher incentive to get into a cleaner used or new vehicle. And then Finance and Assistance, which also adds in the component of trying to get you into low-cost loans if you're a low-income consumer. Then there are the clean mobility projects, which I touch on a little bit more detail on the next slide. And then our third component, if you could go back, our third component of equity that really came out of those priority recommendations is it isn't enough for us to just offer money to people to upgrade their vehicle. It isn't enough to just go to a community and say, hey, we have money to start a car sharing project. We needed to pull out and direct resources specifically for outreach, technical assistance, workforce development, transportation needs assessments, and planning. There were too many dots that we were not connecting by just offering incentives for communities. There was a lot more that we needed to do. And in the next slide, since 2014, we've launched 5 different clean shared mobility project categories. And within each of these categories, we've incorporated all of the information, all of the lessons learned from our solicitations and our projects that started out in 2015, and the recommendations that we had listed in the guidance document, and then what we've learned from the projects as they're on the ground. I've listed the 5 categories here. We did launch a project specifically to get cleaner vans out for agricultural workers. One of the recommendations in the guidance document was, how can we build a program around schools? It's really where you have an opportunity to educate, to put in shared mobility in a school and to educate kids from the get-go that clean transportation, active transportation, clean mobility is something that they should just expect. And if we start it there, then you know, as folks grow up and become adults, that's just the expectation of how they should live. So we did do a solicitation and have started launching 3 projects in disadvantaged communities. The third project is a rural school bus pilot project. A lot of rural communities don't have the local funding to get into zero emission school buses, so this program was created to target those school districts and get them into zero emission buses and infrastructure. And then the next 2 projects, the statewide clean mobility options voucher pilot program, we did launch 6 local car sharing projects since 2014 through 2 solicitations, and we learned a lot. We learned that we need to provide a lot more guidance, a lot more assistance to communities versus just signing a grant and giving them money. And so what we developed over the last couple of years in the Shared Youth Mobility Center is one of the project partners on is the statewide Clean Mobility Options Voucher Pilot Program, which offers a streamlined way to get funds directly to communities through a first come, first served application process. So communities don't have to apply to a competitive solicitation. The program administrators team, which includes SUMC, has developed a technical assistance and capacity building component, and they've launched outreach efforts since late 2019. And so when we opened up the funding windows in mid 2020 and most recently in October, communities didn't just have to apply and figure things out along the way. They could get the technical assistance, they could get capacity building to understand what it means to put an application together. And then it's not only going to help, and this technical assistance and capacity building isn't just going to be there and leave them off when they get funding. So we've created this program where when a community gets funding, that they're going to have the technical expertise to help them develop and launch a car sharing and clean mobility project. And then over the 4 years of operation and implementation, as issues come up, they'll still have our administrator there to help out, to understand how to overcome challenges. Some things may work and some things may not work. And then how to get these programs, these mobility programs to be sustainable in the long run. The last project category is similar to our Clean Mobility Options projects, except they're based on a more community-based approach that one of our sister agencies took a couple of years ago, called the Transformative Climate Communities Program, where they provided a lot more money to transform a whole community. The STEP program really focuses on transforming the community, but focuses on the transportation part of it. And so we actually just announced awardees today for implementation grants and planning grants. And so we're going to fund 3 communities for implementation to really transform their whole community's whole transportation into zero emission, and then 8 planning and implementation grants. And so through all of this work, if you want to go to the next slide, I've got 2 slides on some of the things, some of the lessons learned that we've learned. There's many lessons that we've learned from these projects, but these 2 slides really focus on some of the ones that kind of rose to the top as I was thinking through everything that our communities have gone through. And if you just start from the top, these projects require a lot of money to create and develop clean shared mobility within a community, and to also meet the equity and justice goals that we've overlaid. In the beginning, our equity goals were just to increase transportation for low-income and disadvantaged communities. Now we've got racial justice goals that our board has adopted, and we're trying to overlay that into these programs. So it's not only just getting funding out to these communities, but are there communities of color that are being missed? How do we address getting outreach? How do we address capacity building for those? And of course, that takes a lot of money to do that. The second bullet, it takes a lot of time to create these new mobility projects in communities. These communities aren't used to and don't know how to do these things. And so it takes a lot of time, and a lot of these communities don't have the infrastructure. And so you've got to deal with a lot of new barriers that we didn't even recognize when we released the guidance document a few years ago. The barriers that arise too, I mean, we know going into these projects, communities are going to have certain barriers to overcome, but there's been a lot of new barriers that we just did not foresee. And one of the fortunate things we did not do at the beginning is set too many requirements. We have a lot of flexibility. And so if we can if we can build that flexibility in from the start, it's a lot easier to deal with unexpected barriers. Another thing that we've learned is that whatever solutions we come up with, one of those solutions doesn't solve all the problems for all the different communities that we have in California, ranging from urban communities, rural communities, and tribal communities. We have different issues in different urban communities. We have different issues in different rural communities. So one solution doesn't solve all. And then we've been told this, and we're trying to incorporate, but we're trying to be bold and open-minded in developing creative solutions for the barriers that have come up. And I think through a lot of hard work, a lot of questions and discussions with our grantees, they've been able to overcome many of those barriers, but we're still seeing new ones as we increase funding and investments in these communities. The next slide, you got to listen to your community residents. It's meeting equity and believing in equity and meeting the goals of getting investments out to achieve those equity goals. You got to talk to the residents. You got to figure out what they have and what they don't have. And then when you make investments, you got to listen to them, and you got to see what's working and what's not working. None of our projects have been perfect. We've had to adjust in every single one of the projects. And I see that, you know, I can kind of tell that we're going to have that with the vouchers that are being awarded through this last window. The next part, it's really important, connecting partners. Oh, sorry, if you can go back. The next bullet, it's important to connect partners that are willing to do the work. Long-term commitments are key. It takes a long time to launch these projects. It took us a couple of years to launch the Blue LA project due to all the infrastructure challenges. And then develop metrics and understand successes and failures. We're working with the Shared Use Mobility Center on developing metrics for the voucher program. We also have a contract with the University of California at Berkeley. They have a lot of expertise in shared mobility. So they will be reviewing a number of our existing projects and helping us develop that analysis for some of our new projects through the voucher program, through the STEP program, and through clean mobility in schools. And then one of the lessons learned is it does cost a lot of money, and revenue from users may not cover all the costs. Shared mobility in many ways is similar to transit. And so as we move on to the next two slides, if you can go to the next slide, I'll talk about some of the policies that I think are top priority to really focus on, to really help address a lot of the lessons learned that I just went over. First off, for equity, racial justice, you got to set at the forefront of everything you do, from day one when you write down an idea to a year into it, to understanding what's working and what isn't, to operations once the project's launch. You really have to keep in mind equity and racial justice components of it. You're going to have a car sharing project where a car has a recall. Right? And it's real easy to focus on that recall and put all that energy in to get that car fixed. But there's so many other things with these mobility projects that you just need to think about, like, is the outreach working? High upfront capital costs are just part of the equation. That needs to be accepted when states and local governments are coming up with budgets. There is a lot of upfront capital costs that are required to go into this, very similar to transit. The next bullet is you need to understand historical practices and make investments to overcome those practices. It's not simple. It's not as simple as just putting money out there, putting a car out there, having it be available to residents. You got to think about a lot more things and what these communities have had to deal with, and then put those investments into trying to overcome those barriers. And also don't shortchange them. One example we had from one of our work groups last year is we had proposed to only fund level 2 chargers instead of fast chargers. And the comments we received were, you're already shortchanging disadvantaged communities. You're not even allowing the best technologies to be out there. And so it really made us think, hey, we can't just put limitations on there from the get-go. We have to offer these underserved communities the best that we possibly can. The next bullet, prioritize building capacity within communities. As I mentioned, this is one of those things that communities don't know what shared mobility is most of the time. If they have transit buses, they see that, but they don't really know that much about car sharing. They don't know as much about electric bike sharing, micro transit. So really educating and raising awareness within communities is the key. You know, teaching them about active transportation. There's a lot of barriers that low-income communities have that more affluent communities don't have when it comes to active transportation. Many low-income communities don't have bike lanes. They have police forces that they're scared to ride bikes on because they think that they'll be pulled over, you know, because historically, that's what has happened. These communities don't know anything about zero-emission technologies. One of our meetings down in the Central Valley a couple of years ago, one of my staff brought her plug-in hybrid to the meeting, and afterwards we showed them what it was, and they had never seen an electric vehicle before. And this was just 3 years ago in the Central Valley. So it's brand new for a lot of these people. And if you jump to the next slide, identifying community transportation needs is critical. So that's where I mentioned before, you got to engage the residents. You got to understand what their needs are, but you also have to educate them, because if they don't understand how a car sharing project works, they're not going to want to use it. And so you need their buy-in from the get-go in order to develop sustainable projects. And that kind of leads into the next step, or the next bullet is, you know, you got to be community driven at all stages. Listen to them from the beginning to the end and be able to make adjustments. You also need to ensure that the benefits are intentionally delivered directly to the residents. There's going to be a lot of partnerships. There's going to be local governments. There's going to be community-based organizations. There's going to be mobility providers. And yet you should always focus on ensuring that the residents are getting the benefits directly to them. And as I mentioned on one of the lessons learned, how shared mobility is similar to transit, it provides public benefits. It's not just purchasing a car for one household to use. These shared mobility projects are open to the communities, and they may require ongoing government investments to be sustainable. That's something we're learning right now. We think of our money as seed money to provide the high upfront capital costs. But we really need to figure out what revenue sources are there to be able to make these sustainable. You can't put all of the burden of long-term sustainability on the cost of the users. Low-income residents don't have the money to sustain these. And so trying to figure out additional ways to bring in revenue, which may include ongoing government investments. This next slide, I like to put up, we presented this to our board a couple of years, in 2019, because we wanted to show them that all of these equity investments, the $300 million that we have, we've built all of these partnerships because of the communities, the nonprofit organizations, the local governments, shared use mobility centers in here. All of these partnerships have been built, and it takes strong partnerships to ensure that the investments that you make in your communities are meeting your equity and transportation goals. And with that, you know, I think Sharon is on here, and I know that I just wanted to thank Sharon for her leadership at SUMC. You've built a great team for us in California and in a number of our projects, and we could not be here without your organization's contribution. So thank you, Sharon. The next slide, I think we can just copy and paste and put some of that into the chat. It's just links, contact information and links to our program. So with that, I appreciate everyone's time.
Great, thank you so much, Sam. We're going to move right along to Ashwat Narayanan with Our Streets Minneapolis. Ash?
Thank you, Erin. Yeah, it's great to be here and great to hear from you, Vicki and Sam. And I see many people on the attendees list who I've had the privilege to work with over the years. So yeah, it's just really great to be able to present today. My name is Ashwat Narayanan. I go by Ash, and I am the Executive Director of Our Streets Minneapolis. Next slide, please. The one after that. And so just a little bit about our organization. So Our Streets Minneapolis, we are based in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and we are a local nonprofit based in the Cedar Riverside neighborhood of the city. And our mission is to make the city of Minneapolis better for folks who are biking, walking, and rolling. Rolling meaning people in wheelchairs or even folks in electric scooters and things like that. So a little history about our organization. We started back in 2009 as the Minneapolis Bicycle Coalition. And a lot of the protected bike infrastructure that exists in the city today is a result of the organizing that was done by folks involved with the coalition. Back in 2017, we changed our name to Our Streets Minneapolis because we also wanted to focus on folks walking and rolling. You can see some of our campaigns on the slide here, and these campaigns have had a pretty major impact on city policy. Specifically, I also want to mention Open Streets, which is our signature summer event series where we close major corridors across the city to cars and then open them up to folks, biking, walking, and, selling food, dancing. It's a picture on the slide from folks at Open Streets here. And I really think that Open Streets are a powerful visualization of what our streets could be if we actually prioritize people on them and not just cars. Our organization has also been working to dismantle racism in transportation, both within our organization and the work we do. And a little bit about me, I myself joined Our Streets Minneapolis just about 2 years ago. My background is in civil and traffic engineering, and before Our Streets, I worked at the state level in Wisconsin to help move the state towards building a more equitable, low-carbon transportation system, which is where I got the chance to meet a lot of you who are on the call today. Next slide, please. So back to transportation emissions in Minnesota. As you can see, and this is familiar to most of you, transportation today is the largest source of carbon emissions in the state. And it is a sector that is growing, as both Vicki and Sam, you've mentioned. It's grown 30.5% since 1990, and the biggest reason for that is how much we're driving. Next slide, please. So, both in Minnesota and across the United States, our transportation system really has been designed to move and store cars. And because of that, it really, driving today is the largest and fastest growing source of carbon emissions. So VMT in Minnesota was 60.4 billion, which is up 44% since 1992, much far outpacing population growth, which only grew at 26%. And this also has significant impacts, disproportionate impacts on communities of color. For communities of color breathe worse air, and folks of color, the people who are least likely to contribute to climate change, are also going to face its worst impacts. Next slide, please. And so, transportation decision making, both in Minnesota and across the United States, has had certain characteristics. It's been white-led. Often decisions have been made for Black, Indigenous people of color and not by them. And often these decisions leave people out, and they've been top-down, often made behind closed doors. And most consistently, I think, it has always favored the movement of cars over all else, both in Minneapolis and Minnesota and across the country. And this has had major consequences for our communities. So I just want to talk a little bit about what those consequences are. If you move to the next slide, and then the slide after that. I think the biggest consequence, and this is something that's probably familiar to most of you, is where we have chosen to put our streets and our roads and our freeways. When the freeway system was being built in the 1960s, they were often intentionally routed through Black communities. Here we see I-94 through Minneapolis and St. Paul that went through the historically Black Rondo neighborhood in St. Paul and North Minneapolis, another historically Black community. It destroyed many Black homes, businesses, and destroying wealth in communities of color. The effects are still being felt today to the point where even the Minnesota Department of Transportation came out and apologized for constructing that freeway a few years ago. Next slide, please. And as I mentioned before, there's also disproportionate impacts on the decisions that we made. We have an epidemic of traffic crashes in the United States today. We know close to 40,000 people die each year in the country. In Minnesota, we have over 350 fatal and severe crashes on our streets. And there's a huge disproportionate impact on who is impacted as well. Native American community members are 5 times more likely to be killed while walking than white Americans, and Black Americans are 2 times more likely. Almost everybody we know someone who was killed or injured or affected by a car crash. And again, this should not be normal. And this is, again, a decision we've made in terms of where we've chosen to put our streets and how much we've focused on driving as our primary mode of transportation. So next slide. So if we, wanted to build a more equitable system that seeks to repair some of the harms that we've caused, we need to be less auto-focused, and we also need to reduce vehicle miles traveled, and we need to reduce driving. As this graphic shows, we have a very narrow window to prevent catastrophic climate change. And so even with electrification of our transportation system on a large scale, we simply cannot hit our targets without reducing driving. And in the process, we have an opportunity to build a more equitable and just world that really puts the needs of those who've historically been left out of transportation decision-making in the past. The rest of this presentation, I just want to focus on our work with the Minnesota Department of Transportation, who have recognized, the need for reducing carbon emissions from the transportation sector. Thank you. And have created what they're calling the Sustainable Transportation Advisory Council. This is a council that's co-chaired by the Commissioner of Transportation, Margaret Anderson Kelleher, and has over 20 other people, I think, from various professions, organizations, and a few elected officials as well. So this is a group that's coming together to figure out all the different ways in which we can reduce transportation emissions. And each year, this group will be making recommendations to MnDOT that the agency will then seek to implement. A subgroup of this council is the VMT reduction work group that I co-chair with another member of the STAC. And so the goal of this work group has been to identify ways in which we can equitably reduce VMT statewide. So we've been working over the last 3 months to identify recommendations that we are making to the STAC to be adopted that we think should be next steps in reducing VMT. So I just want to be clear that these recommendations have not been formally adopted by the STAC. That will happen in December. And these are also not MnDOT's own recommendations. These are simply the recommendations of the work group that that Our Streets Minneapolis and others have been working on. So the next few slides will talk about what those recommendations are and what we think the next steps will be. So I just wanted to talk about our approach to these recommendations. So we have a physician on our team, and she suggested that our approach be molded by the Hippocratic oath that doctors take, which is first, do no more harm. So we as a group decided to kind of examine where existing policies of the agency may be contributing to, increasing emissions, worsening climate change, and increasing inequities. So we looked at those, and then we looked at where the agency could start doing things that could more directly advance the public good. And a lot of those things, Stan covered in his presentation. And so we had literally tens of strategies that came up over these conversations. And I just want to show you the top three, which we think will have the biggest impact and can be done right away. We wanted to make sure that these recommendations could be taken immediately by the agency and start being implemented in projects that were ready to hit the ground. Next slide, please. Our first recommendation, and this would not be a surprise to anyone, was to establish a VMT reduction goal. As I said before, we simply cannot hit our carbon reduction targets without also significantly reducing VMT. Any efficiencies that we've made through, any gains that we've made through more efficient cars or electrification have really been wiped out in the last few years by larger SUVs being sold, by much more driving that's been happening. And so I think it's really important that we recognize that reducing VMT is a critical piece of getting to our carbon emissions goals. And so our first recommendation was to establish a VMT reduction goal statewide for the agencies. We can't change what we don't measure. So we recommend that the agency adopt a statewide goal. And then we also recommended that this goal be incorporated into the purpose and need section of every major transportation project. So when you're looking at the reconstruction of a major highway, for example, we have several goals that the agency would be usually trying to hit, usually around congestion and around safety. But we think that adopting, reducing VMT should also be a goal of each project. And one way we thought that we could do this right away was to incorporate it into the reconstruction of Interstate 94 between the cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul. This is a major project that's coming up that will cost hundreds of millions of dollars, and because of how long the design life for these highways are, it'll impact lives for decades. And we think this is a really good opportunity for the agencies to start putting this recommendation into practice. And finally, we ask also that the MnDOT track progress each year towards this goal in their annual sustainability report. Next slide, please. Our second recommendation is moving away from highway capacity expansions as a solution for congestion. I think by now, most of you are familiar with the science. The science is really clear. We've found over and over again that highway capacity expansion does not reduce traffic congestion. And a recent report that was put out by Transportation for America highlighted that, of the largest 100 urbanized areas in the US, freeway capacity grew by 42% from 1992 to 2017, while population grew by 32% in that same time, and traffic congestion increased by 144%. And so, instead of capacity expansions actually relieving congestion, we're finding over and over again that they may actually be doing the opposite, increasing congestion. And capacity expansion projects are also, some of our most expensive projects, leaving, Sam mentioned several times how expensive a lot of the work that he's doing is. And, capacity expansion just leaves very limited resources for the maintenance of our existing system and also for investing in, low carbon modes of transportation. So this recommendation really was part of the do no more harm piece. Highway capacity expansion perpetuates inequities, as I described earlier, bisecting communities, increasing particulate matter emissions, especially amongst BIPOC communities that live alongside these highways, and generally create, inhospitable places to be. So our recommendation is that we no longer focus on highway capacity expansion and instead focus our resources on the maintenance of existing infrastructure and funding low carbon modes of transportation. And we think that this goal should be incorporated into the I-94 project as well. Next slide, please. And finally, our critical piece of reducing VMT is being able to provide convenient and reliable zero carbon ways for people to access their destination. And, the MnDOT owns thousands of miles of right-of-way throughout the states. And we think that one way to, provide access to opportunity is to repurpose existing highway lanes to prioritize high occupancy vehicles. This will prioritize, mass transit, shared vehicles, reducing times for transit and other high occupancy vehicles. It'll provide increased mobility, connecting people to opportunity, folks who especially don't have access to cars. And again, we think that implementing this on the 94 project is going to be a really good opportunity for us to start making some progress on that. And then there were a couple of second-tier recommendations that this group will be, doing its work in 2021 as well. And so we wanted to provide the agency with, immediate actionable steps that they could take this year. And we'll continue to, refine our recommendations and think about other ways in which MnDOT can start reducing VMT from its right-of-way that it owns. But there were a couple of other major recommendations that we are calling second-tier recommendations. One is, most of you are familiar with level of service as a measure that really prioritizes car throughput. We're asking the agency to move away from that in favor of more people-centered metrics like accessibility, which is being increasingly used by many people, including California, I believe. And also, we're asking for an audit across various project categories. Today, a lot of transportation funds are mandated to be spent by our state constitution on just highway purposes, and we're asking to see if there's flexibility there. What does highway purpose exactly mean? Could it, for example, fund bus rapid transit on an existing highway lane? And so basically, we're asking for an audit to see where there may be flexibility with the goal of moving funds away from highway capacity expansion and into maintenance, public transit, biking, and walking. And finally, we're also asking that the agency support local governments. For example, the city of St. Paul and the city of Minneapolis both have really strong VMT reduction goals. The city of Minneapolis wants to reduce, wants to have 3 out of every 5 trips be made by walking, biking, and rolling by 2030. And the city of St. Paul has a really ambitious VMT reduction goal as well. And so anything that the agency can do to support local jurisdictions, especially where there's a lot of lane miles that pass through these local jurisdictions, I think will go a long way towards helping our collective carbon reduction goals in transportation. So next slide, please. Yeah, that's my last slide, and I'll turn it back over to you, Erin.
Thank you, Ashwat. So we are going